Think about what happens in times of crisis. Panic, uncertainty. People rarely support a leader who will honestly say, "Friends, the situation is dire. There are no simple answers. We will have to work hard, carefully weigh everything, make inevitable sacrifices." Number. Instead, like moths to a flame, they fly towards the one who confidently, thunderously declares, only I can fix this. The solution is elementary. Look at how real climate scientists talk about climate change, with cautious caveats, with ranges of probabilities, with detailed but complex recommendations. Now listen to how popular figures, politicians, bloggers on both sides of the aisle present this same problem, with absolute, unwavering confidence. The scientific approach, for all its intellectual honesty, can hardly compete with the psychological comfort of simple, understandable narratives. The same goes for economics, healthcare, international relations. Real experts acknowledge painful trade-offs. Politicians offer simple, magic pills that promise everything at once, without any side effects. And which approach do you think usually gets mass support? The simple one, and the certain one, regardless of its actual feasibility. In one particularly shocking 2017 experiment by Yale University researchers, something truly alarming was discovered. When subjects were presented with mathematically complex political problems and their solutions, their ability to correctly interpret the data depended directly on whether the results aligned with their pre-existing political beliefs. But here's what was even more astounding. The most mathematically proficient, most educated participants showed the strongest bias. They used their intellect not to find the right answer, but to more skillfully justify their already prepared, preferred conclusion. Psychologists call this cognitive closure, our desperate adherence to simple, final answers, our flight from any ambiguity. Research shows when people feel threatened, insecure, afraid, their need for this cognitive closure skyrockets. They become more susceptible to black-and-white thinking, and more willing to follow authoritarian leaders who exude absolute, unshakable confidence. This is a most dangerous dynamic. The more complex and frightening our world becomes, the more susceptible we are to simplistic thinking and to those leaders who actively promote it. It's like a psychological autoimmune disease. It's precisely when we most need nuanced, critical, sophisticated thinking that we become most vulnerable to intellectual surrogates, to brain junk food. Ask yourself honestly, have you ever felt an inexplicable attraction to some explanation, to some idea, precisely because it was simple and certain? Even if some part of you, somewhere deep inside, suspected that reality was much, much more complex. That's the very principle. It's working right now, in your head. Lesson 6. Morality as an obstacle. When conscience hinders the path to power. While our psychological comfort with simplicity partly explains this sad dynamic, there's another aspect, even more disturbing, one that shows why intellect itself, even the highest, doesn't guarantee effective resistance to manipulative power. And it's here that Machiavelli becomes truly terrifying. He suggested that moral considerations, ethical principles, often become the main obstacle for intelligent people in their struggle for power. In what is perhaps his most infamous, most quoted passage from The Prince, he wrote, "A prince who wishes to maintain his position must learn how not to be good, and to use this knowledge or not use it according to necessity." While intelligent, reflective people tend to develop more complex, nuanced moral thinking, This very thinking can actually hinder them in the ruthless struggle for power against those unburdened by such chimeras. And think about this. In any competitive environment, be it business, politics, or even office intrigues, a person willing to cross ethical boundaries immediately gains access to a whole arsenal of strategies unavailable to their more scrupulous competitors. They can make promises they have no intention of keeping. They can undermine opponents' reputations with lies and slander. They can shamelessly exploit fears, prejudices, the basest instincts of the crowd, things a decent person would simply disdain to touch. Recall the contrasting fates of Cicero and Julius Caesar in ancient Rome. Cicero, a brilliant orator, philosopher, a principled republican, ultimately lost the power struggle to Caesar. Caesar, who didn't hesitate for a second to cross the Rubicon, literally and figuratively, to violate every conceivable and inconceivable norm that his opponents considered sacred and inviolable. In modern conditions, we see this everywhere. Ethical, honest candidates desperately struggle against opponents who, without the slightest compunction, resort to the dirtiest technologies, to the total annihilation of reputations. In an organizational context, researchers from the University of British Columbia found something shocking. Psychopathic traits such as a lack of empathy, cold calculation, manipulativeness, are positively correlated with rapid career advancement, especially if combined with superficial charm and social agility. This pattern, this regularity, can be traced across very different cultures. From the archetype of the ruthless Sheng Nu, leftover woman, often implying a career-driven, tough businesswoman in China, ready to step over anyone, to outwardly prosperous Scandinavian companies, where research, to the surprise of many, shows. Despite all the cultural emphasis on cooperation and empathy, manipulative, ruthless leaders often outpace their more ethical colleagues in career advancement. This creates what game theorists call a race to the bottom. When unethical practices bring success, when they are rewarded, other players in the game face a cruel pressure. Either adopt similar, effective approaches, or be left behind, be devoured. Over time, this can transform entire systems, entire industries, entire societies, making unethical behavior not the exception, but the norm. Lesson 7. The environment decides. Where incompetence thrives. Understanding this dark, ruthless dynamic might make the situation seem hopeless, but that's not entirely true. Not all environments, not all systems, equally encourage incompetence and unethical behavior. Once we recognize the conditions that favor the flourishing of stupidity and power, we can begin to think about how to design systems that, conversely, will select people based on their true merits, on their competence, on their decency. Machiavelli understood this perfectly. Different environments encourage different qualities. Some contexts, some conditions, naturally promote the selection of the best, while others provide the most fertile ground for incompetence not just to survive, but to bloom luxuriantly. What does it depend on? On several key structural factors. Factor 1. Feedback loops and accountability structures. Imagine a surgeon whose patients constantly die on the operating table, or a bridge engineer whose bridges regularly collapse. In such fields, where feedback on decisions made is swift, clear, unambiguous, and where mistakes have to be paid for, incompetence is quickly identified and weeded out. There, as a rule, Genuine specialists are selected because failures are obvious and their consequences fatal. But what happens in conditions where feedback is delayed in time? Where it's indirect, blurred, where it's easy to distort or manipulate? That's where incompetence can flourish almost indefinitely. Political systems where the consequences of failed decisions can easily be blamed on predecessors, on external enemies, on objective circumstances. Huge corporate hierarchies where real results can be hidden behind layers of creative accounting and PR smoke. Media landscapes where entertainment, skill, hype are often more important than accuracy and depth. All this is ideal, fertile ground for the rise of incompetent people who are skilled at pulling the wool over others' eyes. Factor 2. Institutional structure and power distribution. Centralized systems of power, with few checks and balances, with no independent oversight, are a real hothouse, an incubator for the growth of incompetence. The collapse of the Soviet Union, for example, was largely accelerated by a system that concentrated all key decision-making and the full weight of irresponsibility in a very few hands. And conversely, in Germany, for example, the two-tier corporate governance structure, clearly separating management and supervisory functions, creates a certain structural resistance to the reign of incompetent management. Factor 3. Information asymmetry and complexity. When success is easy to measure, when results can be objectively compared, merit, as a rule, wins. But when goals are vague, ambiguous, when success is judged subjectively by some fuzzy criteria, that's where style often prevails over substance. Remember Machiavelli's words? Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand. Because everybody can see you, few can touch you. He understood that most people judge others based on superficial impressions, not deep, thoughtful analysis, especially in complex, specialized fields where only a few truly possess the knowledge and skills to make an informed judgment. Factor 4. Economic incentive structures. Systems that reward short-term, immediate results rather than long-term, sustainable value create fertile ground for the emergence of incompetent leadership skilled at creating a facade of bustling activity. The 2008 financial crisis very clearly demonstrated how incentive structures that encouraged immediate profits, regardless of colossal, long-term risks, contributed to the emergence of a whole cohort of leaders who prioritized outward glitter, showmanship over real substance. And now, ask yourself, what environmental factors, in your country, in your city, in your company, even in your family, promote the development and advancement of competence, and which, conversely, create conditions for the flourishing of incompetence and cronyism? Understanding these invisible but powerful structural forces can help you choose your own path and learn to recognize when the systems around you become vulnerable to manipulation.